Council Minister Davrin stood before the holographic display, watching red markers spread across the star map like a plague. 3 colonies lost in as many months. The Vren Dominion's advance was methodical, unstoppable, and heading straight for the heart of the Kethran Republic. He was a tall creature by human standards, nearly 2.3 meters, with pale blue skin and large, dark eyes that had evolved to read the subtlest emotional cues in his people. Right now, those eyes saw only disaster. "Minister, we must face reality," General Tholey said from across the strategy table. The general's voice carried the tremor of someone trained for ceremonies, not war. "Our defense forces are inadequate. We have 12,000 soldiers across all our worlds, and most have never fired a weapon outside of qualification tests." Davrin's secondary hands flexed in distress, a gesture his people made when confronting the unthinkable. The Kethrans had built their civilization on trade, art, and philosophy. Violence was something they studied in historical texts, not something they practiced. "The Council will never approve a military expansion in time," Davrin said quietly. "Even if we started conscription today, the Vren would reach Kethis-4 before we could train a meaningful force." "Then we need time," Tholey's replied. "We need someone who can fight while we prepare for surrender negotiations that might preserve our autonomy." Davrin understood what the general was suggesting, even if the word hung unspoken between them. Mercenaries. The very concept felt dirty, paying outsiders to die for Kethran interests. But what choice remained? "The humans," Davrin said finally. Tholey's skin rippled with disgust and involuntary response. "Deathworlders, yes, they have a reputation." That reputation was precisely why Davrin was considering them. Humanity had emerged onto the galactic stage only 40 years ago, and in that time they had become infamous. Their world was a nightmare of competing predators, toxic atmosphere, crushing gravity, and temperature extremes that would kill most species. Somehow, humans had not only survived but thrived, developing a culture that glorified competition, conflict, and something they called sports, which seemed to be ritualized combat for entertainment. When humans had discovered faster-than-light travel, they had also discovered there was money in violence. Human mercenary companies had quickly earned a reputation, expensive, brutal, but utterly professional. They honored contracts to the letter, and they were terrifyingly effective. "Contact Sentinel Company," Davrin ordered. "Offer them a 6-month defensive contract for Kethis-4. Whatever their rate is, pay it." 3 weeks later, Captain Marcus Reid stepped off the transport onto Kethis-4 main spaceport. He was short for a human, only 1.7 meters, but he moved with the economical grace of a predator. His face was weathered, scarred along the left jaw, and his eyes held the flat calm of someone who had seen too much death to be shocked by it anymore. Behind him came the rest of Sentinel Company, 200 soldiers in matte black armor, carrying weapons that looked crude but well-maintained. They moved in formation without being told, each soldier instinctively covering angles, watching for threats that didn't exist on this peaceful world. Davrin watched them disembark and felt his skin ripple again. These creatures were dense with muscle, moving with predatory efficiency. Even their casual gestures seemed aggressive, sharp, and economical. "Captain Reid," Davrin greeted, extending both primary hands in the Kethran gesture of welcome. Reid clasped them briefly, his grip firm but not crushing. He understood alien customs. "Minister, General, let's talk business." The briefing was concise. Kethis-4 held 3 million Kethran civilians, mostly farmers and food processing workers. The planet was the agricultural heart of the Republic. Losing it meant losing the ability to feed their remaining populations. The Vren fleet was 6 weeks out minimum. 20 warships, troop carriers estimated to hold 40,000 soldiers. The Kethrans had 3 orbital defense platforms that were 60 years old, plus a handful of patrol craft that were never designed for combat. "It's going to be a ground war," Reid said, studying the planetary defense grid. "Your orbital assets won't last an hour once they arrive." "We know," Tholey's admitted, his skin flushing with shame. "We need you to make them bleed, to buy us time for negotiations." Reid looked at the general for a long moment, and Davrin saw something calculating in those human eyes. You're planning to surrender. We're planning to survive, Davrin corrected. If we can make the conquest costly enough, the Vren might accept terms that preserve some of our autonomy rather than complete annexation. Reid nodded slowly. It was a reasonable strategy for a species that couldn't fight. Understood. My company will defend this world for 6 months. After that, we extract, contract fulfilled. That is acceptable, Davrin said, though his heart ached at the transactional nature of it. These humans would fight and die for Kethran interests, all for credits that could be transferred electronically. Reid stood, extending his hand again in the human gesture. Then we have a deal, Minister. Sentinel Company is yours for the next 6 months. The first week was chaos. Lieutenant James Torren, Reid's second-in-command, took one look at the Kethran Defense Forces and wanted to weep. They were hopeless. Tall, graceful beings who flinched at loud noises and had to be coaxed into even holding rifles. Torren was younger than Reid, only 28, with dark hair and eyes that still held some idealism despite 3 years of mercenary work. He joined Sentinel Company after the corporate wars on Earth had destroyed his hometown, killing his parents and leaving him with nothing but rage and a need for purpose. Now he stood on a firing range, watching a young Kethran soldier named Veles try and fail to hit a target at 50 meters. I cannot do this, Veles said, his voice breaking. He was barely into adulthood by Kethran standards, his skin still showing the faint patterns of youth. I am not made for violence. Torren felt a spike of frustration, then forced it down. These weren't soldiers. They were farmers and teachers and artists who had been handed rifles and told to fight. It wasn't their fault. Nobody's made for violence, Torren said, sitting down beside the tall alien. We just do it because we have to. Here, let me show you something. He took Veles through the basics again, patiently, explaining breathing and trigger squeeze and sight picture. The Kethran's hands shook, but gradually shots started landing closer to center mass. I joined the company when I was 19, Torren said, still coaching Veles' stance. First time in combat I froze, completely locked up. My sergeant had to physically drag me to cover. Veles looked at him with those large, dark eyes. But you are human, a deathworlder. Doesn't matter what world you're from, Torren replied. First time under fire, everyone's scared. The trick is doing it anyway. Across the base, Sergeant Ana Delgado was teaching Kethran engineers how to build proper defensive positions. Delgado was short and stocky, even by human standards, with burn scars up both arms from an incident in the I.O. refineries before she joined the company. She had a gift for explosives and fortifications, seeing terrain the way artists saw canvas. The Kethrans were actually decent students in this regard. They understood structural engineering, and once Delgado explained the principles, they grasped the concepts quickly. Within days, they were digging proper trenches, building reinforced bunkers, and learning to turn urban terrain into a defensive maze. You are patient with us, one of the Kethran engineers observed. I thought mercenaries would be harsh. Delgado looked up from the demolition charges she was assembling. What's the point of being harsh? You're trying to learn. Besides, if you don't know this stuff, you die. And if you die, we have fewer people watching our backs. It was pure pragmatism, but the Kethran seemed moved by it nonetheless. In the medical facilities, Private First Class Devin Wright was teaching triage. Wright was lanky and soft-spoken, with gentle hands that seemed at odds with his combat medic certification. He'd been a civilian emergency responder before Earth's economy collapsed, and he joined Sentinel Company because it was the only way to keep using his skills. The Kethran medical staff were skilled, but they'd never dealt with combat trauma. Wright walked them through the brutal calculus of battlefield medicine, who to treat first, who to stabilize, who to let die because saving them would cost 3 other lives. This is barbaric, one of the Kethran doctors whispered. Yes, Wright agreed simply. War is barbaric, but if you're going to be in one, you need to know this. By the end of the second week, something unexpected was happening. The humans and Kethrans were beginning to bond. It started small. Human soldiers sharing their rations with curious Kethrans. Kethrans offering their own food, watching in fascination as humans ate things that would be toxic to most species. Conversations in broken galactic common, supplemented with gestures and patience. Torin found himself spending evenings with Veles and his squad, answering endless questions about Earth and human culture. The Kethrans were particularly fascinated by human entertainment. "You have competitions where people strike each other for sport?" Veles asked, incredulous. "Boxing, yeah," Torin confirmed. "Mixed martial arts, wrestling, dozens of variants. We like testing ourselves against each other." "But why? What purpose does it serve?" Torin thought about it. "I guess it's about proving something to yourself, about pushing your limits. We're a competitive species." The Kethrans struggled to understand it, but they listened intently, and slowly Torin realized he was enjoying these conversations. These weren't just clients, they were becoming something else, something more. Reid noticed the same thing happening throughout his company. His soldiers were forming connections with the Kethrans they trained. It was natural, he supposed. Humans were social creatures, and spending 12-hour days working alongside someone created bonds whether you wanted them or not. He saw it in how Delgado stayed late to help a Kethran engineer with a tricky demolition calculation, in how Corporal Yuki Matsumoto, his best sniper, spent her off-hours teaching Kethran spotters how to read terrain and wind, in how Wright sat with wounded Kethrans during their recovery, just talking, offering comfort. Reid kept his own distance, maintaining professional boundaries. He'd learned that lesson the hard way years ago. Get too close, and it hurt too much when they died. And people always died in this business. But even he found himself drawn into conversations with Davrin and Tholes during their evening strategy sessions. The minister was brilliant, with a mind that saw patterns and connections that Reid's tactical training had never covered. Tholes was less impressive militarily, but he cared deeply about his people, and that counted for something. "Why did you become a mercenary?" Davrin asked one evening, after they'd finished reviewing defensive positions. Reid considered deflecting, then decided honesty wouldn't hurt. "Earth's economy collapsed when I was 22. Corporate wars tore apart entire regions fighting over resources and markets. I joined a corporate security force because it paid and I was good at it. When the wars ended, military skills were about all I had left, so I formed my own company with others like me." "It sounds like you had no choice," Davrin said softly. "There's always a choice," Reid replied. "I chose this because I'm good at it and because I believe in keeping my word. We sign a contract, we fulfill it, that matters." Tholes spoke up hesitantly. "Do you ever regret it, selling violence for credits?" Reid was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes. But my people eat, they have purpose, and they're alive. That's more than a lot of veterans from the corporate wars can say." It was as close to philosophy as Reid ever got, but he could see it resonated with the Kethrans. They understood duty, even if they struggled with violence. The Vren arrived early. Intelligence had projected 6 weeks. They came in 4, sending a Vanguard force of 3 ships and 1,200 soldiers to the northern continent, away from major population centers. Reid got the alert at 4 p.m. By 15 minutes, he had half his company mobilized and moving to intercept. "They're probing," he told Torin as they boarded the transport. "Testing our response time and capabilities. We need to hit them hard enough that they think twice about the main invasion." Torin nodded, checking his rifle. Around them, 100 human soldiers performed the same rituals they'd done before every battle, checking weapons, adjusting armor, making dark jokes to settle their nerves. 3 Kethran platoons were deploying with them, including Veles' squad. The young Kethran looked terrified but determined. Torin caught his eye and nodded. Veles nodded back. The Vren had landed in a canyon system, using the terrain for cover from orbital surveillance. It was smart tactics, Reid admitted. The Vren were reptilian, 2.5 meters tall with thick scales that acted as natural armor. They were strong, tough, and experienced conquerors, but they'd never fought humans before. Reid deployed his forces in a crescent, using the canyon walls for cover. Delgado's engineers were already placing charges at key structural points. Matsumoto and her sniper team took positions on the high ground. Torin's infantry, supported by Kethran squads, formed the main line. Vren advanced in standard formation, expecting light resistance from ceremonial defense forces. Instead, they walked into a carefully prepared killing ground. Matsumoto fired first, her shot dropping a Vren officer at 800 meters. Before the body hit the ground, the canyon erupted in gunfire. Human weapons were chemical propellant-based, primitive by galactic standards but brutally effective. High-velocity rounds punched through Vren scales. Grenades turned their formations into chaos. And the humans fought with a coordinated aggression that shocked the Vren into momentary paralysis. The Kethrans, bolstered by weeks of training and the presence of human soldiers beside them, held their positions and fired. Velis's hands shook, but his shots found targets. Around him, his squadmates did the same, their fear overcome by training and desperation. The Vren recovered and pushed forward, using their superior strength and numbers. They were experienced warriors, and they adapted quickly. The battle devolved into close-quarters brutality. Torin led a countercharge when the Vren tried to flank. His squad hit them with bayonets fixed, fighting with a ferocity that drove the larger aliens back. Beside him, a Kethran soldier fell, shot through the chest. Torin grabbed him and dragged him to cover, still firing with one hand. Wright was there instantly, his medic bag open. "I've got him, Lieutenant. Keep moving." Delgado waited until the Vren committed their reserves into the canyon, then triggered her charges. The walls came down in a thunderous cascade, burying half the Vanguard force under tons of rock. The survivors broke and ran. Matsumoto's snipers picked them off as they retreated. By the time the Vren reached their landing zone, they'd lost 800 soldiers out of 1,200. The humans had lost 12 dead, 34 wounded. The Kethrans had lost 45 dead, over 100 wounded. It was a devastating victory, but it came at a price Reid felt in his chest. That night, Sentinel Company held a memorial service for their fallen. It was a human tradition, gathering to remember the dead. They didn't make speeches or grand proclamations. Instead, they shared stories. "Martinez made the worst coffee in the company," one soldier said, smiling through tears. "Tasted like engine lubricant. We told him every single day. He never got better at it. Chen could cheat at cards better than anyone I've ever met," another added. "We all knew he was cheating, we just could never prove it." The stories continued, each one a small piece of a life now gone. The humans laughed and cried in equal measure, honoring their dead by remembering them as they'd lived. The Kethrans attended, invited by Reid. They stood at the edge of the gathering, watching this ritual they didn't fully understand. But they felt the weight of it, the genuine grief mixed with affection. After the service, Velis approached Torin. The lieutenant was sitting alone, staring at nothing. "You knew them all," Velis said quietly. "Every name, every story," Torin nodded. "We're a company, a family, that's why we fight, not for the contract, not really. We fight for each other." Velis sat beside him, and they shared a moment of silence for the dead, human and Kethran alike. The Vren main fleet arrived 2 weeks later. 20 warships materialized at the edge of the system and began their approach to Kethis-4. War leader Krivik stood on his flagship's command deck, studying the tactical display. The Vanguard's defeat had been unexpected and costly, but ultimately meaningless. He had 40,000 soldiers and orbital supremacy. This world would fall within a month. The Kethran orbital platforms died within the first hour, their outdated weapons unable to penetrate modern shields. The patrol craft managed to damage one Vren destroyer before being destroyed themselves. By the time Kethis-4 sunset, the Vren controlled the orbitals completely. Troop carriers began landing the next morning. Krivik's strategy was methodical: establish beachheads, advance in force, crush any resistance. His species had conquered 17 worlds using these tactics. The 18th would be no different, except it was different because of the humans. Reid had consolidated his forces around New Kethara, the planetary capital. The city held 1.2 million Kethrans, and its urban terrain would favor defenders. He'd spent the last 2 weeks turning it into a fortress. Every major intersection was fortified. Buildings were rigged with charges for controlled demolition. Sniper positions covered every approach. Supply caches were distributed throughout the city. The Kethran Defense Forces, now numbering 8,000 soldiers after emergency recruitment, were integrated into human-led units. "We can't win a conventional battle," Reid told his officers and the Kethran commanders. "We're outnumbered 25 to 1. But urban warfare is different. We make them bleed for every street, every building, every meter. We make this so costly they'll consider negotiating rather than losing more soldiers. Tholes, who had grown noticeably more confident over the past weeks, asked the question everyone was thinking. How long can we hold? Long enough, Reid replied. It wasn't much of an answer, but it was all he had. The Vren entered New Kethara on the 23rd day of the siege. They advanced in battalion strength, expecting resistance but nothing they couldn't handle. Matsumoto's snipers opened fire first, dropping officers and communications specialists. Before the Vren could locate the shooters, Delgado's IEDs turned 3 streets into kill zones. Torin's infantry hit them from the flanks, then melted back into the urban maze before the Vren could respond. It was a pattern that repeated across the city. Attack, inflict casualties, withdraw. Never hold ground, never fight on the enemy's terms. Use the terrain, use mobility, use the Vren's own size and strength against them. The Kethrans, inspired by the humans' example and desperate to protect their homes, fought with a determination that shocked both sides. Veles' squad held a critical intersection for 3 days, turning back 5 separate Vren assaults. Other units followed their example. Civilians helped too, providing intelligence on Vren movements, tending to wounded soldiers, keeping supply lines open. The entire city became one interconnected defensive network. Krivik watched his casualty reports climb and felt something he'd rarely experienced: doubt. 3 weeks into the urban battle, he'd lost 6,000 soldiers and controlled barely a third of the city. The humans were fighting with a ferocity he'd never encountered, and somehow they'd made the Kethrans fight the same way. These deathworlders are changing the battlefield calculus, his second-in-command observed. Every assault costs us more than it should, Krivik snarled, baring his fangs. Then we commit more forces, crush them through sheer numbers. But even he was beginning to wonder if the cost was worth it. In the makeshift command center in New Kethara's government district, Reid studied casualty reports and felt exhaustion pulling at him. 4 months into the contract, his company was down to 140 effectives. The Kethran forces had lost nearly 3,000 soldiers. Civilian casualties were climbing despite their best efforts. And now Davrin was delivering news that made it all feel pointless. The council has voted to accept surrender terms, the minister said, his skin flushed with shame. The Vren have agreed to spare the civilian population if we capitulate within 1 month. It's the best deal we could negotiate. Reid nodded slowly, understanding but hating it nonetheless. When does the contract expire? 7 days, Davrin said quietly. 7 days. Reid had known it was coming, but the reality still hit hard. 7 days and Sentinel Company would be extracted, their obligation fulfilled. The Kethrans would surrender, and whatever happened after that wasn't his problem, except it felt like his problem. It felt personal in a way contracts weren't supposed to. We'll hold until then, Reid said. Make sure the transition is as clean as possible. Davrin left, and Reid sat alone in the command center, staring at maps that suddenly felt meaningless. He called a company meeting that evening. All 140 surviving soldiers gathered in what had once been a school auditorium. They looked tired, battered, but unbroken. These were his people, soldiers who'd followed him through 3 years of contracts across a dozen worlds. The contract expires in 7 days, Reid said without preamble. The Kethrans are surrendering, will be extracted on schedule. He paused, then added, the Kethran government has offered us a new contract. 2 weeks triple rate to oversee the transition and ensure orderly surrender. The room was silent. Reid could see them processing it, understanding what he wasn't saying: take the money and leave, or stay for a fight that was already lost. Delgado spoke first. What happens to the Kethrans who fought with us? Veles and his squad, all the soldiers we've been training. The Vren's surrender terms include labor conscription, Torin added, his voice tight. Military-age Kethrans will be enslaved for reconstruction work, minimum 10-year terms. More silence. Reid watched emotions play across his soldiers' faces. They were mercenaries, professionals who fought for credits, but they were also human, and they'd spent 4 months bleeding alongside the Kethrans. Wright stood up, his gentle voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. I didn't join this company to abandon people. That's not who we are. Matsumoto nodded. "We've never left anyone behind." "Why start now?" One by one, his soldiers spoke up. Some argued for practicality, for honoring the contract's letter and moving on. But most, the overwhelming majority, said the same thing in different ways. They couldn't just leave. Reid let them talk, watching his company come to a consensus without his input. Finally, he spoke. "If we stay beyond the contract, we don't get paid," he said bluntly. "We'll burn through our operational reserves in weeks. The company will go into debt. Some of you might not get paid for months." "I didn't join for the money," Delgado said. "I joined because you keep your word, Captain. You said we take care of our own. Well, the Kethrans are ours now." Reid looked at her, then at the rest of his company. He saw determination, loyalty, and something he'd tried to keep out of mercenary work: principle. "All in favor of refusing the transition contract and staying on Kethis-4 until this is resolved?" Reid asked. Every hand went up. All 140 soldiers voting to fight for free, to risk everything for people who couldn't pay them. Reid felt something tight in his chest loosen. Pride, maybe, or just recognition that he'd built something more than a mercenary company. "Then we stay," he said simply, "and we finish this." The news spread through the Kethran forces within hours. The humans were staying, beyond their contract for no payment by choice. Veles found Torin on the barricades that evening. "Why?" he asked desperately. "We cannot pay you. We cannot even promise you victory. Why would you stay?" Torin looked at the young Kethran, remembering the terrified farmer who couldn't hit a target at 50 meters. Now Veles was a soldier, still scared but fighting anyway, protecting his people with courage he'd never known he had. "Because you're our brother now," Torin said, putting a hand on Veles's shoulder. "And we don't abandon family." When Krivik learned that the human mercenaries had stayed beyond their contract, he actually laughed. "Fools," he told his officers. "They fight for nothing. They'll die for nothing." But his laughter died when the next assault hit human positions and lost 400 soldiers in under an hour. The deathworlders were fighting harder than ever, and the Kethrans beside them matched their intensity. Something had changed on the battlefield. The defenders were no longer just trying to survive or buy time. They were fighting with the desperate fury of people who refused to surrender, who would rather die than give up. Reid knew they couldn't hold forever, but he had one more card to play, one desperate gambit that might break the siege. "We're going to trap their main force," he told his officers and the Kethran commanders. "Draw them into the city center, then bring the whole district down on their heads." It was insane. It was also their only chance. Delgado spent the next 72 hours rigging the entire central district with explosives. She worked without sleep, crawling through rubble and ruins, placing charges with precision despite exhaustion. Her engineering team, human and Kethran, matched her pace. Matsumoto's snipers provided overwatch, picking off Vren scouts and patrols. They were down to their last ammunition reserves, making every shot count. Torin's infantry conducted a fighting withdrawal, pulling the Vren deeper into the trap. It was brutal work, giving ground grudgingly, making the enemy pay for every meter. His squads took casualties, but they held together, human and Kethran fighting as one. Wright and his medics worked in conditions that would have broken civilian doctors. The field hospital was overwhelmed, supplies nearly exhausted. When the surgical equipment failed, Wright amputated a Kethran soldier's crushed arm with hand tools and field anesthetics. The soldier survived and word spread. The gentle deathworlder who wouldn't let anyone die. 3 weeks after the contract expired, the trap was ready. The Vren had committed 15,000 soldiers to the city center, including Krivik's command unit. They were confident, certain that the defenders were at their breaking point. Reid watched from a building overlooking the district. His company was down to 94 effectives. The Kethrans had less than 4,000 soldiers still combat capable. They'd lost so much, bled so hard, but they were still here, still fighting. "Execute," Reid ordered. Delgado triggered the charges from a remote position. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world became sound and fury. 40 city blocks collapsed in a coordinated demolition. Buildings pancaked onto Vren positions. Support columns failed in carefully calculated sequences, creating cascading failures that turned the district into a death trap. The ground shook like an earthquake. Dust and debris created a choking cloud visible from orbit. When the dust cleared hours later, the Vren main force had been decimated. 8,000 dead or trapped beneath rubble. Krivik himself was pulled wounded from the ruins, his command staff shattered. The Vren fleet watched their ground invasion collapse. They'd lost over half their expeditionary force. The simple conquest had become a nightmare, and intelligence was reporting that more human mercenary companies were volunteering to come to Kethis-4, offering their services for free after hearing what Sentinel Company had done. The Vren withdrew 3 days later, not a surrender, just a tactical retreat. There were easier conquests, worlds that wouldn't cost so much blood. Kethis-4 wasn't worth any more casualties. The siege was over. New Kethara was in ruins, but it was free. The Kethrans had survived, not through surrender but through victory. The Kethran government tried to pay Sentinel Company retroactively. Reid refused. We didn't stay for credits. Instead, they offered citizenship. Every human who fought for Kethis-4 was granted full Kethran citizenship with land, rights, and honors. Some accepted, choosing to help rebuild. Most, including Reid, politely declined. They were soldiers and there were other fights calling, but they accepted one honor. In the center of New Kethara, the Kethrans erected a memorial. It listed every name, human and Kethran, who died defending the city. At the top, an inscription in both languages. They were not bound by contract. They were bound by honor. Reid stood before it on their last day, reading the names of his fallen soldiers. Beside him, Davrin and Tholes waited quietly. "You changed us," Davrin said softly. "We were a people who didn't believe in violence. Now we know we can fight when we must." That knowledge will echo through our culture for generations. "Just remember why you fought," Reid replied. "Not for conquest or glory, to protect what mattered." "We will remember," Tholes promised. "And we will remember the humans who taught us that some things are worth more than contracts." 3 months later, Sentinel Company was on a transport back toward human space. They were broke, deeply in debt, and it would be months before they could take another paying contract. But morale was high. Torin was reading messages on his datapad. "Veli's passed officer candidacy. He's training the next generation of Kethran soldiers, says he's teaching them what we taught him." Reid nodded, satisfied. Around him, his company performed familiar rituals, equipment maintenance, physical training, the endless routine of soldiers between battles. "Captain," Delgado called. "Got the new job postings. There's a colony world under pirate siege. Low pay, high risk, probably messy." Reid pulled up the contract details. It was exactly as described, dangerous, complicated, and unlikely to be profitable. He looked at his company. They were tired, scarred, unbroken. These were people who'd chosen to fight for nothing because it was the right thing to do. They were more than mercenaries now. They were something the galaxy had never seen before. "What do you think?" Reid asked, already knowing the answer. The response came in tired grins and nods. They were in, because that's what humans did. They didn't fight just for credits. They fought for each other, for the people beside them, for things that couldn't be bought or sold. And once you stood beside a human in battle, you became part of that circle. You became family. The galaxy was learning that lesson, slowly but surely. Reid smiled and accepted the contract. There was work to do, and his company never left a job unfinished. The transport jumped to FTL, carrying Sentinel Company toward their next battle, their next impossible fight, their next chance to prove that some things mattered more than money. And across the galaxy, on a dozen worlds, other species were beginning to understand. When you hired humans, you weren't just buying soldiers. You were buying something far more dangerous and far more valuable. You were buying loyalty. And that changed everything.